Everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Townsend. I am the Senior Marketing Director at Imaginatik, and it's my pleasure to invite you here today to engage with us on a great topic about innovation across all the different dimensions that exist within an organization. Imaginatik, as you may know, is an innovation firm which focuses both on providing a rich set of services and supporting software platform to help companies like yours develop innovation into the very fabric of your company. And an important aspect of that, we believe, we know from our experience, is being able to innovate across all the different modalities of interaction. Today I have here with me Elisa O'Donnell. She is our VP of Innovation Solutions and has a rich history in delving into all the different spaces and realms of innovation. She has a professional background that has taken her across several decades of management consulting and innovation services experience, most recently with Synectics and also with Continuum and now with Imaginatik. It is my pleasure to introduce Elisa O'Donnell. Before we get started, I want to mention that if you have questions, please type them into the panel, the GoToWebinar panel on the side of your screen. There's a questions menu. We will try to answer the questions as we go along and also at the end. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Elisa. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning and to share with you all a perspective that we have here at Imaginatik on how to engage employees for innovation. And what we'd like to do is share with you what this engagement means, some techniques on how you might be able to do this in your organizations, and probably most importantly, what's the prize? If you do this, what does that mean and translate into for your organization? So let's begin with that first question. Why engagement? Why is it so important today in organizations? Well, if we think about what engagement really means, it's not just about getting employees to do something, it's about a true emotional, strong connection that they have with the organization that really impacts how they interact and the kind of work and mindset that they have in the organization to get work done. And so this is really a very important aspect because it implies, their level of involvement, it implies a level of enthusiasm for actually doing their best in an organization. And it's a really important concept for innovation, because when you think about innovation, innovation is first and foremost about people. And it's about people who come together for a purpose, exchanging ideas, exchanging thoughts and perspectives, sharing their expertise. And it's about those same people being able to work independently, alone, reflecting on those interactions they've had with others, and taking the time to actually process them and take action on some of those thinking. So it's a very important aspect for innovation. And one of the things we also know is in organizations today, there is a gap in employee engagement. In fact, one of the statistics that is recently been published by the Conference Board indicates that 50% of employees would say they are not engaged in their organizations. And they take that further and say that an additional 20% of employees actually say they're disengaged. So imagine that, 70% of your employee base is either not engaged or actively disengaged. What a huge opportunity that represents to unleash that perspective and those experiences and knowledge base that they have and engage them for the purpose of innovation. One of the other reasons why we believe engagement for innovation is really important is the concept that people, when they generate their own ideas, they will embrace what they create and they will resist what they absolutely have not had a part in. So if you can engage people in the innovation process, in coming together and making new ideas, making new connections, there's a much greater likelihood that those ideas will actually go forth and be implemented. And that represents a huge cultural shift opportunity, going from a culture where ideas get stuck inside the organization to a culture where there is momentum and confidence and success stories to share around innovation and innovation successes. What happens when you don't have it? Well, it's just like this visual that you're seeing here. It becomes a barren landscape, a barren climate in an organization. You could get little bursts of activity. So just like this plant, you will get pockets of innovation if you don't have engagement. But what you won't get is this systemic view and engagement around innovation where this plant grows into a tree and there's a fertile soil and foundation for innovation to happen. So how do you do this? If you think about engagement, it's really multidimensional. There are three elements that we consider when we work with our clients. The first element is obviously the mind, how people think, because it's so important in influencing how people actually interact. And secondly is consideration of the environment that they work in. And we consider the environment that they work in from two perspectives. One is the physical space, so how people come together and work independently in the physical structures of your organization. And the other aspect is the third space around innovation, which is the virtual space. We know people cycle through these spaces multiple times during a day, virtual space being online, responding to emails, participating in maybe online communities. So what we'd like to do is share with you our perspective on each of these spaces and some ways in which you can create engagement in them. Before we do that, one other aspect we want to share with you is a concept called bump, the bump rate. The bump rate is really about people coming together across the organization, outside of the organization, who have different expertise, and it's this bump, this coming together that actually creates this powerful spark, a new connection to drive innovation. And there's lots of examples of success with bumping. In fact, part of a big initiative that I have been involved in the past is actually here in our hometown in Boston, which prides itself in a very powerful bump rate. One of the reasons Boston becomes a hub for innovation is because it has this ability for people independently to connect and come together in their city. The example of Gillette and how Gillette actually got formed as an organization was a bump encounter with the inventor of the razor and a financier bumping on the street, just bumping into each other, discussing the idea, discussing the opportunity for financing, and that's the genesis of Gillette. So powerful, powerful concepts, and one that we want to be thinking about when we consider engaging through innovation. So let's go into the first space, which is the mind space, and talk a little bit about that. Mind space, again, really important because what I can see is really the results of what happens inside your head. So your communications, your interactions are really the product of the way that we think, what we can't see, the mental models we have in our organization, the values and beliefs that we have about the organization itself, the culture, even about different individuals and groups that we interact with. That actually translates into communications. So how can we actually impact this is really by creating awareness around how these mental models influence the climate for innovation in communication styles. One of the ways we experience this with our clients is we hear them say a lot, our VP would never let us do that, or we really don't have a culture that's supportive of innovation. And what they're suggesting to us, that's a visible symptom of what's actually going on in the mind space. And so how we work with them is we actually create this mindful awareness of this mind space. We videotape meetings, and we debrief on those meetings so that we can understand how the visible aspects, how we are interacting, is actually influencing either positively the climate for innovation or negatively the climate for innovation. So spending time with people to actually create this mindful awareness is actually a very powerful way to initiate the right foundation for innovation to thrive. So let's take a look at that mind space. And I know, because you're all in the innovation space, that you've heard about, it takes passion, it takes the ability to take risks in innovation. Yes, that's very true. And what I want to also share with you is that there are other elements that we'd like you to think about. One is positivity. The innovator's mind space is an open space where it's a climate of can-do, where it's a climate of what's possible and engaging people and others along the way with their enthusiasm for this. It's also a climate of courage, right, inside that mind space. That's the flip side of taking risk. You have to have courage. And it's also about developmental thinking, which is a way to actually nurture ideas and give them a chance to grow before they get evaluated. So if you look at this visual, the innovator's mind space, consider that little bubble of water, that if you have that right mind space and you have this positive contagion, courage and developmental thinking, it really acts like this ripple inside the organization. And this isn't just about leaders that should display this. We all have stories of famous leaders who have that. Richard Branson being one of them with Virgin. The whole reason Virgin is named Virgin was because he'd never done this before. He'd never had an airline before. It was virgin territory, a lot of courage. It's also about people in the organization themselves. So, managers who are day-to-day practitioners of innovation, directors who have responsibility for making innovation the muscle inside the organization. And we've worked with teams that have displayed courage, where they have generated ideas and literally gone out the next day. One example that comes to my mind is a store manager in a grocer chain, where we came up with an idea, and he was so excited by this that the next day he actually tried it out in the store, bought some props from home to create this really rough prototype of bringing this idea to life, because he was so convinced and had the courage to do that. So important mind space and important attributes. One of the other things we know about the mind is the brain itself is a huge connection-making muscle. So if you think about this lightning visual, that really is a metaphor for how our brain works. When we get new stimulus, it sparks all these neurons that connect new pieces of information in new ways. And so for this to happen successfully, we need open mind space, a mind space that is receptive to making these new connections, and being aware of the filters that prevent the connection-making muscle from working is really important. So how do we do this? What are some of the things we can do to really flex this muscle and create this dynamic of this lightning show of connection-making? One of the things we can do is we can work with paradoxes and contradictions. So typically what happens in an organization, if there's a paradox, two things that don't go together, that seem to be conflicting, instead of dismissing it, we work with it and we say, how can both be true? What new things could it suggest? We work with absurdity, getting people to be very, very speculative in their thinking and think the absurd ideas. Working with that forces new connection making, because you're releasing elements of your subconscious that you ordinarily would not do for the purpose of innovation. So teaching our clients these different types of techniques is an important enabler to lay that right foundation for innovation and for engagement. So let's move on. That was mind space. Let's move on to what happens in the physical space for innovation. When you think of the physical space for innovation, most often what people think about is that conference room. And sitting in a conference room, much like the picture you are just seeing, where you have a round table, you have people sitting around a table, you might have some flip charts or a whiteboard, etc. And then that wonderful visual underneath, what happens in that meeting? We have PowerPoint presentations, and we have more PowerPoint presentations. And the challenge there is really about engagement, and how do you actually engage people in that kind of a space? Well, what we are seeing and what we do with our clients when we want to have creative collaboration, because that's really the precursor to innovation, is looking at different kinds of ways to engage them in these spaces. So the visuals that you're seeing in the orange frame here around creative collaboration, you'll notice that there aren't chairs here, for example. People are interacting around a visual chart. It's not a PowerPoint chart, it's actually a map. This is one way we can actually get people to engage in a process that is very different from the typical environment that they work in. It could be as simple as taking that conference room that you have and removing that table and putting a graphic recorder in to record your conversation, having people interact around it. One other aspect you'll see here at the bottom is around public thinking and post-it notes. Post-it notes are a very powerful enabler of innovation in the physical space setting because they represent a visualization of an idea, and something on a post-it note is usually handwritten, and something that's handwritten implies a level of messiness still, a level of unfinishedness about it. So if you have that, what that does is it invites people to collaborate and build on that in a more powerful way than a PowerPoint presentation will do, which seems very polished and very, very finished. So I would encourage you, when you're thinking about the physical space for innovation, think about ways you can take that physical space that you have, conference room, other areas, and use that, repurpose that in a way that drives a deeper level of engagement. So what we just talked about was the structured space for innovation. That's the structured meeting space, the conference room. Another aspect we'd like to bring into this mix is the serendipitous spaces for innovation. And here's where we tie that concept of bumping. When you think about bumping, where does it happen outside of a meeting room? We'll think of, again, the metaphors. The metaphors are so rich for our thinking and for innovation. But think about the water cooler space, and what does that conjure up in your mind when you think of the water cooler? You think of people that, hey, come together and go, hi, what's up? What are you working on? A random interaction that can spark innovation. And so the challenge and the opportunity we have for innovation in the physical space is not just looking at the meeting rooms, but how do you create these bump opportunities in your organization, in hallways, for example, in cafeterias or coffee stations. We have clients, for example, one pharma company that has a deliberate strategy of putting coffee stations every 30 feet on a floor. Why? Because it's about creating these bump opportunities. Even though they've had consultants come in there and say, this is too expensive, if we want to reduce costs, take the coffee stations out. And they refuse to do it because they think the impact on innovation would be quite negative. We've had other organizations that have policies of not allowing employees to eat at their desks. Why? Because they want to encourage a bump. They want them to go to the cafeteria. They want them to get up and walk so that they can have this serendipitous bump space. And we have clients that look at hallways, particularly hallways that are connecting buildings in large corporate campuses. And instead of having that as dead space, they've actually created areas and lounges with wall-to-wall chalkboards. It's really just paint on a wall where people can just bump into each other, discuss something. This is the technical organization, so they draw some different diagrams, and more people join them in the conversation. So again, I would like to challenge you to think about, when you're looking at spaces for organization, how can you look beyond the meeting space and foster this kind of serendipitous bumping for the purpose of innovation. So we've talked about spaces for collaboration. We also know that innovation can happen independently, and so what about those private spaces for innovation? Well, we have, yes, the office environment where you can close your door if you're lucky enough to have one, and reflect and think. We also know that even in open space plans for offices, we see people like this person you're seeing with the headphones on that want to create time for aloneness. So what he has here with these headphones is really a great visual cue that says, don't disturb me, I want some uninterrupted time, I want to be able to think and reflect. So providing that in your organization and the opportunity to do that is really, really important. One of the things that we have heard and read in a lot of the research around innovation is that private space actually gives you time to reflect, and time without interruptions is really, really critical for innovation. So giving people the opportunity to do this. And again, we have some clients that have actually implemented policies of saying no meetings on one day a week. So Friday is a meeting-free day where we will actually let people reflect and think and work on something without the interruptions of, I've got to go to that next meeting. So again, another space for innovation, making sure that there is some balance to bring in these private spaces. What we've shared with these spaces is really inside your four walls in the organization. There are also spaces for innovation that exist way beyond these walls, and we call these discovery spaces. One of those spaces is the customer space, and actually going out into the customer environment and seeing that customer in their own context, so in their world, either at work, at leisure, at home, but getting a rich knowledge of that particular customer group or target market. This is a really critical space for us, and it's really different than having focus groups. Because when you think about a focus group, you are really creating a tiny little microcosm of their world, and you're not experiencing it as they're experiencing it. And I use the analogy here of a zoo. When you think about animals in the zoo, think of, do you really learn what that zebra is like in the zoo? You can read what the zookeeper has said about them. You might be able to see that zebra walking around, but you really don't have that rich context as if you'd seen and witnessed that zebra in its natural habitat, right? Being chased by predators, you know, eating its food after it's caught it. It's a whole different appreciation of that particular animal. Likewise, with your customer base, it's a whole different appreciation if you can get out and experience them. And one of the things we encourage our clients to do is, this isn't just about the insight team going out. It's not just about the marketing team. It's about everyone in the organization having an opportunity to discover something new in their customer base by being out in that environment. So senior executives too should be part of this discovery space. Another space here is what we're calling an analogous world space. And one area that we've talked about is with customers. Another is, how can you actually take a group of people who are working on an innovation challenge and look at aspects of that challenge and take them on a journey where they can experience other worlds that could provide them with new thinking on how to address that particular challenge. So in this example that you're seeing, we took a team, it was a product team, who was involved in sun care products, and we were working with women as a target market, and we actually rented a bus and we took them to different businesses who dealt with women, their target consumer, but in different aspects of their life. So when you think about sun care, you could think about sun care as being a very personal and sensual thing. So go visit a lingerie store, understand how they, in the lingerie world, actually interact with their customers. What do they do to engage their customers? Chocolates. Again, women and the aspect of the sensory experience around chocolate, how do we actually learn something from what chocolatiers do to engage, particularly with all the sensors? If you go into a chocolate store and you can smell something really rich, you want to go and eat that. How do they actually use that to their advantage, and what can we learn and apply in sun care? And then carpet, that was another area we went into, going into a showroom. If you think about putting sun care lotion on your body, again, it's a sensory feeling. So carpets, when you think about buying a carpet, very sensory. You want to touch it, tactile. So giving a team that really focuses on one aspect of their customer, i.e. their application of sun care products, and exposing them to different worlds where they also interact with that sun care customer, but in different aspects, very rich learning spaces for innovation. So the challenge and the opportunity in each of these spaces is really being able to remove your filters and see that world, that consumer world, that analogous space world with new eyes. And one of the challenges I think we have in organizations today is people want to articulate the problem and rush right forward into let's generate ideas. And what we do is we actually slow them down by making them go into these discovery spaces, looking at the consumer with completely new eyes, not thinking about ideas, but trying to let all this information wash over them, going into these analogous world spaces and looking and experiencing those. We're actually slowing them down in the front end, but what's happening in the back end when we're ready to ideate is we're getting much richer, more powerful, more transformational type ideas. So really important for innovation. So we've shared with you some aspects of physical space, how to really think perhaps in new ways about that space. And it's all sounding great, right? We can do wonderful things in the physical space. Well, why is that not the end of the story? Well, it's not the end of the story because the physical space, while it's a very rich space, it has some limitations. So how many of you have been in those offsites or these wonderful conference room settings where you've got all these wonderful Post-it notes? What happens to them after that conference room meeting or that offsite? How do you engage people with that information after that without physically bringing them back and having the expense of that? And how do you actually make sure that that learning that you had in that physical space gets acted on and can get built on in a wider audience? And so that sort of brings us into our next space, which is our virtual space. Before we share that, there's some questions that you have for us, so we'll take a moment to share those.
Elisa, thanks so much. I think we'll pause here for a second. I noticed there are some questions on the GoToWebinar. We want to actually address those as we go along. If anyone else has a question based on the beginning of the presentation so far, feel free to type it in to the questions panel on the GoToWebinar controls, and we'll be happy to answer all the questions you have. We have one on, so you mentioned at near the beginning of the spaces part, the physical spaces part, the idea that Post-it notes are actually a really great tool because they're unfinished, and that because they're unfinished, they can lead to, I guess, better collaboration. Can you talk a little more about finished versus unfinished and the importance of unfinished in creativity?
Yeah, so again, the concept of unfinished is that there's a messiness to it, right? A handwritten note implies that it's not a finished note, and what that does is it creates people wanting to make that finished. So it creates this cycle of building upon it. And what you see with Post-it notes is somebody typically will put a Post-it note on and it'll trigger another thought, and people will put another one up next to it. And this visualization of all these unfinished things, and then somebody says, oh, what that really is about is X. So Post-it notes are a vehicle that allows you to go from these beginning thoughts, and really all ideas when they're born are just these beginning thoughts, being able to cluster them in a very visual way and put a new label on that that says, this seems like a more finished thought. So it's a way to develop your thinking in a visual aspect.
Great, that's great. We also, I think some of this will be coming up in the next part of the presentation, but someone was asking, you know, how do you move some of these public spaces? So this is back in the when we're talking about the water cooler and making bump spaces for people around the office, around the workplace. How do you bring that into the virtual world? And I don't know if you want to address that here or in the next section.
I'd like to address that in the next session because we talk about the virtual space and some of the techniques that we use there. So I will do that.
Sounds good. You talked about these sensory journeys, and there's a question about you know, how big of a group would you engage on that, and how long would it take, and what does the rhythm look like for making that really work?
Yeah. So again, it is largely dependent on the type of challenge we have and the mix of people involved. But to go back to the example that I shared of that sun care product team, we were engaged with them over a 2-month period, and this learning journey that I shared with you was a 1-day learning journey that involved 30 people. And we went into different environments. So what we did with that was we took those learnings and went into an insight session after that, which was another day's work with them. Mm-hmm. That gives you some perspective.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So another question we have is do you think that every company out there would want to design specific innovation spaces, or is it context dependent, or how would the, you know, designing office spaces, physical spaces vary depending upon the type of company?
I think space is an important element, and I think it's about collaboration. It's having organizations design collaboration spaces beyond what is typically envisioned, which is just the meeting space. I think that's a very important aspect. I also think there's a challenge here because when people think of innovation, their first tendency is create an innovation team, and we will have a separate space for them, and everybody who wants to be creative goes off to this separate space. And if you're not in that separate space with, you know, beanbags and crayons, you're not creative. That's the caution, because engagement is about taking those spaces and integrating those spaces where work gets done every day. So I think that's sort of another twist in spaces.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then one final, there is a question about getting the slides from the webinar. So after this broadcast is finished, everyone who's attended will receive both a link to the recording and a link to the slides. So just stay tuned for that. It will be up within a day or two after the webinar is finished. One other question, just really quickly. So you mentioned that at least with respect to some of these learning journeys, they happen, let's say, upstream of actually throwing ideas out there. Is that true for a lot of the types of physical space type insights that could be created? I mean, is it usually something that comes sort of pre-idea, or?
Yeah, so when you're working in the physical space and in the virtual space, one of the things you want to do is to provide catalytic kind of opportunities for innovation. So some of those are things like the learning journeys that you can do in the physical space, and there are other techniques you can use in the virtual space that help do that as well. And we'll talk more about some of that in the next section.
Okay. Let's see. We actually have a lot of questions. I'll try and answer as many as we can quickly. Let's take one more, and then we'll save some until the end. Are you advocating, so in what you're talking about, Do you think everyone should participate? Is it sort of a company-wide kind of thing? How do you think about crafting engagement within a company?
Yeah, I think that's the end goal, right, is total employee engagement. Do you get that right off the bat? No. I do think that what you get in the physical space is deep engagement. I think in the virtual space you have the opportunity to engage a much wider group of employees. You always want to have this cycling of physical space and virtual space to engage people. Typically in these efforts you would start with a smaller group, maybe in the physical space. That would help sort of frame that innovation opportunity. You might mine some knowledge in the virtual space. That's the engagement. That's much broader. And then you bring it back into the physical space. So one of the things we're saying here at Imaginatik when we think about spaces is don't think of them separately. Think about how you actually cycle physically and virtually. And you start maybe smaller, building out engagement. And engagement comes when people have the opportunity to hear about success stories and say, oh, I want to be part of that. So it's more organic than it is to declare it across the organization as a whole. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about what the virtual space does that will perhaps solidify some of these thoughts.
Sounds good. Thanks. So everyone, I think we've answered at least most of the questions here. We'll take some of them at the end. And please, as we go along, keep putting those in. We'll try and make sure we get to most of them by the end of the webinar.
Okay, so let's move on to our third space, which is virtual and online space. So what I just shared with you in some of the comments that we responded to is the beauty of the virtual space is that it does allow you to engage people across the organization. And we know today we are operating mostly in global companies. We're in a global economy, global customer base. So having this ability to really reach broadly across different parts of the organization and even outside of the organization is really a sweet spot for using online tools. So let's talk a little bit about how we do that. I want to bring you back to this concept and the metaphor of a water cooler. What if you could take that water cooler out to the people so that you're not talking about 2 or 3 people who are physically coming together, but dispersed groups who on their own time, in their own time zones, can actually reflect and think and build on each other's thoughts and share each other's expertise, not just for ideas, but also around strengthening those ideas, so enhancing them and prioritizing them, because virtual tools are really good for that as well. And let's share some of those with you now. So come back to that visual of a conference room and think about if you could extend what happens when you have creative collaboration across the globe. And think about the opportunity that that creates to actually put the innovation challenge or opportunity into a forum where many, many different people can actually engage in it. One of the beauties of this is when you think about the physical space, you are bringing people together. Oftentimes they're sort of held hostage, right? You will attend this 2-day offsite. It's not a voluntary participation. They have to come. Their mindsets may not be very positive. They may actually feel like they're being a hostage, or they may feel like they're on vacation. I'm away from work for 2 days. In the virtual space, it's a bit different because participation is really voluntary. You send that email out and they go in on their own time. And instead of spending 1 or 2 days in an innovation offsite or a meeting, they're usually cycling in for minutes at a time. So it's this quick level of engagement. They can come in for as short as 2 minutes. Typically, we don't see much longer than a 10-minute cycle each time they come in. But what that does is it allows them to pulse in, sort of see what's going on with other people's ideas. They get to input. They go off to their next work task that they have. And now what's happening is the subconscious mind is starting to think about what they just saw. and the next day or 2 hours later, another idea may pop into their head and they have the opportunity to pulse in for a short moment or two. So the meeting space, if you will, gets extended in time and gets extended in breadth in the virtual world, while still allowing you to do the same things you do in the physical world, which is, control the agenda, invite the attendees, choose how decisions will be made, etc., etc. So that's the meeting space. Now let's talk about the discovery spaces that we introduced to you in the physical world. What if you could actually harness everybody's learning from that physical world across your global teams? So talking about your target consumer in China, in North America, in Latin America, and you could get people to share in a virtual tool their knowledge. So if you look at these yellow thoughts here, these are replicating stickies, post-it notes, so important in the physical world. What if we could have the same concept in the virtual world where people could share trends that exist in their market all over the world, just short little bursts of their thinking. They could share the needs of their customers in their particular market segments, or what they've learned about them from a new study that they've done. And what if we could take a smaller team, or even that entire team that has this knowledge base, and say, okay, let's play with this, let's explore it. And this is a tool that actually allows you to gather that information in different kinds of lenses. There are 4 lenses represented here. There could be many more. And actually pull down those thoughts that you find most compelling, or that a product team finds most compelling, or an R&D team, or a marketing team, and lets you look at those as insights and say, if these are true in all these different markets, what new connections can I make? What could that suggest for an opportunity for innovation for our company or our team to pursue? So that takes the power of all this latent knowledge in the organization and allows you to harness that and act on that in a mix of virtual space and physical space. And here's another example of a virtual collaboration space where you can take beginning ideas and post them out into the virtual space, either in a textual format, which is on the right-hand side. So here's a beginning idea, and it's not fully formed yet. We know, because we just worked in our physical meeting space, that we've still got a lot of issues around this idea. But there's something here, it's intriguing, and it allows you to actually set up those how-to, these challenges in that idea, and get a broad level of engagement in generating ideas to overcome that challenge, which in turn will transform that beginning idea and make it stronger and richer and more likely to be feasible for execution. So that's in a textual format. The other way we can use collaboration in the virtual space is using visual collaboration. So this is a pushpin technology where these purple dots that you see are actually pushpins. You click on them, and here you'll see yellow, and what does that remind you of? Those little post-its and the sticky notes. And here is an example of actually oven controls and a new prototype for oven controls. And what this allows you to do is take that beginning story and visual, again, send it out to different parts of your organization and get feedback and be able to see where most of your feedback is coming from, what kind of feedback it is, based on everybody being able to see other people's thoughts as well. So virtual space is a powerful enabler of innovation, an enabler of engaging a broader audience for the purpose of innovation. And then finally, the other aspect, again, you can see this theme we're carrying over with post-it notes and visualization. But if you think about how the prioritization of ideas get done in a typical physical session, face-to-face, where you have post-it notes, people, just like you're seeing here, take those post-it notes and they group them into themes, and they think, well, this is more important than that, etc., etc. Sometimes the virtual tools can really enable a much richer evaluation and more objective evaluation of those new beginning ideas. And what you're seeing on the screen is a technique that we have called head-to-head, where you can imagine each idea as one of those post-it notes, and you can take two random ideas and put them together in front of each other and compare them against criteria that you set, and you move a scale. And so what you do at the end of this, you take your prioritized ideas and you can see the kinds of ideas that rated the highest under a particular dimension, or the kind of feedback you get around, one idea. So it's a powerful way, again, to engage more people in that process and perhaps do it in a more objective manner. So those are really three aspects of space that we wanted to share with you. So how do you sort of put it all together, and how do you need to think about this? We started the conversation telling you about three spaces: the mind, physical, and virtual. The mind being the foundational space that really enables you to engage in the physical and virtual space. What if physical and virtual are not independent spaces, but actually spaces that you integrate your innovation efforts? So one of the parting thoughts we'd like to leave you with is think about physical and virtual spaces and how you cycle through them. When do you want to be in a physical space for innovation? When does it make sense? When you want deep engagement around something, that's good for physical space. But then when do you want to actually take what you learn in that physical space and cycle it out to the virtual space? How can that virtual space be helpful to you? And then again, how do you cycle it back into the physical space? Looking at how these different elements work together is really important for innovation, because when you think about how people work today, they actually cycle through these spaces every day, micro-minutes every hour. So we want to replicate that same experience for the purpose of innovation. What happens if you get this right? Well, yeah, there's definitely a shareholder prize, right, for getting this right. It's about shareholder price and profitability. It's no surprise when you look at companies that have the highest engagement rates, and most of the research we have looked at is self-reported around employee services, employee surveys around employee attitudes for engagement. And what we found was that yes, the top companies, Google, Amazon, Apple, have high levels of employee engagement. And guess what? They're the ones that we would consider being the most innovative. So it appears there's definitely this correlation that you really, if you want to have innovation, you need engagement. You can't really have innovation without engagement. So very, very important. The other aspect around this is really the more intangible pieces of the prize, which is employee retention and loyalty. That people feel they want to stay at that organization, and their interactions, not just with each other, but with their customer base, actually drive a different level of conversation with that customer and drive customer satisfaction rates. So those are really the tangible prizes around engaging for innovation. But what's more of this intangible aspect? Because I think part of when we look at metrics for innovation, we all want to look at the very tangible aspects of, what were the business results we got and how quickly did we launch that. And yet so much of innovation around people and mind space is intangible. So how can we start to look at that? Well, it's really around attitudinals and the perspectives that people have around, gosh, I know that this is possible because I saw this happen. I believe that my ideas are heard. I'm making a contribution, and that really feels good. That makes me feel pride in myself and in others. And the level of energy that they have around their work, and this positive contagion, they elude this, so it sort of is a contagious aspect of the work environment. And one of the other interesting things is it's not just about the employees, because as they talk about their work and engage with customers and suppliers, you get this last point where other innovators people, employees that are in other organizations saying, maybe I want to join you. You sound like you're doing really good things. So it's an attraction, a magnet for really creating broader communities of interest around innovation. So that's really all we wanted to share with you around Spaces for Innovation. We hope that it has opened up some new thoughts in your own mind and at least given for you some questions around what can you do and what can your organization do to really think about these spaces and think about how to engage and cycle through them for innovation.
Thanks, Elisa. That's really wonderful advice. I want to thank you again for being with us today to talk through all of the different perspectives that Imaginatik has on spaces for innovation. We do have a couple of questions here. So I'm going to try and get through them before the top of the hour. The first one, so you've given a lot of advice for how to engage people across all these different dimensions inside a company for innovation. Does the specific type of advice you would give depend whether the organization is focused on incremental versus breakthrough innovation?
I think you still want to cycle spaces, right? Whether you're focused on incremental or breakthrough. You'd want to cycle through physical and virtual and the engagement of the mind. I think the difference with breakthrough is that you really need perhaps a deeper level of engagement, so discovery for breakthrough could be very, very important, and that would imply maybe more physical space kind of work. Insight that could lead to breakthrough is important.
So discovery would be focused specifically on some of these journeys outside of the office.
Exactly, exactly. So that you might do more of that in the physical space if you're looking for breakthrough. And then typically with breakthrough, you do want a higher level of engagement with a smaller group of people that can actually have the courage and the fortitude, oftentimes it's the fortitude, to take that breakthrough idea that could be very different for that organization and move that through the organizational systems so that they can execute.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Another question about using these techniques to really build collaboration and that new culture inside a company. What kind of, if I were early on a journey of building innovation culture into my organization, how long could I expect that to take, and what does that progression look like? I mean, some of the things you've talked about are with smaller groups of people. Some are distributed across the office. Some are virtual and perhaps have a different dynamic. What does the time frame look like?
Well, I'm a great believer in experiments, and I think when you start this journey, you experiment because you really don't know culture until you've experimented in it and you know what you come up against. So starting that journey with pockets of experiments where you can understand what works, what doesn't work, what you need to influence, what you need to accentuate is really important. Getting those pockets and experiments to translate into how the organization behaves overall is a journey that is multi-years because, and again, it depends on the size and some of the areas we want to influence. But one example I can share with you is we started a journey with one firm. It was a global firm, probably about 30,000 employees, and we stayed in one division, so we influenced 10,000 employees. And that journey where they could really say they had a culture of innovation was a 3-year effort where they engaged very differently. We engaged with them, we coached, we mentored in both spaces.
Okay, we have a bunch of other questions. Let's see if we can get through a couple of these before the end of the time. Question around getting good ideas rather than nonsense ideas, let's say. How do you manage, let's say, volume and getting the right yield out of the ideas you collect, whether it's physical or virtual space?
So clearly there are, some of the techniques that we shared with you around pushing people's thinking in new directions is really important. And high-yield ideas often don't show themselves as that when they start out. So it's being able to take what's intriguing and work with it and build upon it that's really important. when you look at sort of a beginning idea, some of the things we do in the virtual space and physical space is we provide some context around it. So sometimes context can help. It can help in two ways. It can help narrow the focus if that's what you want for innovation, so that you are only ideating in one particular area. It could also broaden that lens if you want to do that by doing some things like absurdity and paradoxes and so forth. So depending on that innovation challenge that we were working with would depend on the specific techniques that we would use to sort of manage the yield and type of ideas we get.
Okay, so I'm hearing that there is some degree of being purposeful as an important aspect of really pulling out the right kinds of...
Great word, yes. Purposeful and deliberate in your efforts, yes.
Okay, thanks. And then let's see. So I think certainly there are plenty of organizations that feel that everyone is already overbooked on their time, and finding that space in terms of time to innovate, to do some of these activities, to have that time alone and so forth is difficult. How do you encourage organizations, or how can they build in that time so that people actually can engage in some of these spaces?
Yeah, and I actually think this is where physical and virtual worlds and cycling through them really addresses well is this concept of time. In fact, I had this conversation with a client just 2 days ago where they wanted to do a 2-day physical session to generate ideas for a new marketing campaign. And they said, you know, we're really frustrated because we know that the first half of the first day is all about people throwing out ideas that we already knew about. So it's like, we know we need these 2 days to be able to do that, but I wish we didn't have to. And I said, what if we could actually do 1.5 days and start this with a virtual engagement where people have the opportunity to enter all those ideas. And again, they're coming in instead of for a half day, 2 minutes, and they're entering their already known idea. And then we start their ideation with a 1.5 days of actually now getting those top of mind ideas off the table, and now we're really ready to flex that muscle in different ways. So I think it can enable people to spend less time in physical space but still have engagement. I do believe, though, no matter what, you need time for this. You do need time to engage for innovation. So having the opportunity to reflect is important, doing things with an overnight prospect. So if it's a 1.5 days and you have people come in and then go home, sleep, remember the wonderful stories of I'm in the shower and I have a new idea, allowing the subconscious and minds to reflect is important. You can't get away from that, I think, with innovation.
Okay, excellent. Well, with that, I think we have reached the top of the hour. I want to thank everyone again for being on the line today and hearing a lot about how Imaginatik approaches engagement in all the spaces of innovation. As we've mentioned, you will receive communications soon with links to the recording and the slides from this presentation. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. You can reach us through the Imaginatik website. And would like to thank you again. Have a wonderful day.